are listening to the Bail Post. Welcome to the 37th episode of the Bail Post. And on today's episode, we're going to talk about whether the third time is the charm. We have a rollbacks, and rollbacks about New York bail reform and criminal justice reform. And on today's episode, we have a very special guest who's been with us before, Michelle Esquenazi. Welcome, Michelle.
Hi, how are you? How's all my people in bail land? Mi gente.
You are the president of the NABA Association. Talk about that for a moment.
Well, NABA was formed about 4 years ago, just by a hole in the industry, and it's for bail enforcement agents and bail agents, whether you're a property agent or a surety agent. And basically what we try to do is just collect $50 membership fees, do everything grassroots, and try to give back donations to local and state bail associations that are fighting in their areas. So we were able to just recently support Ohio. I know we have PBT coming up, I think in October. We sent something to California. We're going to send something to New York, Mississippi. So we just try to do the best that we can. We're not like a big organization, but if a bail agent is in need of talking points somewhere in their community, we try to be supportive.
Well, New York's bail reform, criminal justice reform is really what put all of the bail reform across the United States on the map. Before New York attempted reform, we really couldn't, get anything on the news, really. It was very infrequent that you heard anything about criminal justice reform and bad bail reform across the country. But then New York decided to put their foot, or I guess you would say, dip their toe into the criminal justice reform waters, and then it became a big issue nationwide. What was the promise, from New York? What was the promise made by the reformers that bail reform and criminal justice reform 4-6 years ago? What would it do to the system? Because we're going to talk about all the reforms and how it went south and how they've rolled it back. And I want to know, what was the promises originally made?
It's a good question. The promises that were made were the branded talking points that are made nationally. So it's no particular surprise to those of us on the front lines what those were. I would say probably they're the top 3 talking points that the scales of justice would equal out, and that for people that were poor and Black and brown, and that the evil bail industry would no longer make money, and that would be kind of sent over to the government to take over our industry, almost like eminent domain in a way.
Yeah, but the New York reforms were very different from the New Jersey reforms. You were on a guest on our podcast on episode number 19, where we talked about the New Jersey plan, and what was actually implemented in New York was very different than the New Jersey plan, because you didn't have this big infrastructure passed by the state. And so let's talk about what the, I would say, if you're going to look at the tenets of this reform, they're based on what we hear that, people want to come to court, they want to get their cases resolved, and this is going to change the makeup of the jail, because we're going to remove this systemic racial element. And I would say that we learned very quickly that none of that happened. Do you agree?
Well, of course I agree. I mean, I agree 100% from the top of the Empire State Building. I agree. We had told Reformer Nation up in Albany that this was not going to work, that it was going to injure their constituents, and it was going to injure society at a rate that New York could never afford, not only because of common sense reasons like public safety and crime victims, not for simply and only those reasons, but for our global visitors to our once great city. I knew that the travel and tourism industry would not be able to withstand open criminality. We certainly knew that the real estate industry, the retail industry, would not be able to withstand free crime in a city like New York. Um, and preface that by saying whereby Bernie Kerik and Rudy Giuliani had it under control. And people, all like yourself from Texas and many of my friends throughout the nation, were able to come to my city where I grew up, where I practice, and they were able to enjoy our churches, our parks, our Broadway plays, Times Square, things that you see in all the movies growing up. And now I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed what they did to my city and to my state. And I tell people all the time, if you're going to spend your American money, please don't do it in New York.
Well, when I think of the reforms that were passed in New York, I primarily think of the reforms that said if you're charged with these crimes, you are to be released on no bond. What were
Right.
some of the other reforms that were originally enacted? Was that the major part?
Well, yeah, it was, well, it wasn't no bond because that's not New York language, right? So it's basically on the least restrictive condition. And then they removed, then they put bail into classification in terms of the fact that the judiciary would have to look at it as quote unquote bailable offenses. So some offenses were bailable and some offenses were, you had to be either released to a huge government bureaucracy piece or just simply released on your own recognizance, none of which obviously worked.
Did the reforms attempt to target mostly nonviolent offenders? Because that's usually the way they start out by saying, "Oh, we're targeting nonviolent offenders," or did they
Well,
reclassify a lot of felonies to misdemeanors as a part of the reform?
you know, I think that the term nonviolent offenders is offensive, especially to soft targeted humans like women, children, religious people that wear garb, the LGBTQ community, and the elderly. So I tend to totally disagree from a crime victim's perspective, that just because a crime is classified under the auspices or umbrella of nonviolent, it doesn't mean that the victim's receiving it as nonviolent. It means some policymaker in Albany thought that, touching a little girl here, there, and there is okay, and that's nonviolent, but touching her one more time classifies as violent. So it's sickening in and of itself. It needs a complete national revamp.
I agree with that because I think this narrative that we have going on about violent, not violent, nonviolent offenses is really just a way to get to decriminalization of misdemeanors. I mean, that's really what this is about. In as I think that one of the parts of this is we're going to either directly criminalize misdemeanors, or we're going to create enough chaos where you can't get any misdemeanors convicted. We found that a lot of the reforms in Harris County that were implemented by court resulted in an 80% failure to appear. And we learned in California the misdemeanors there, according to a district attorney there, they have a 80% failure to appear rate as well. You can't prosecute cases if you have an 80% failure to appear rate and you don't have the ability to do anything about it.
Well, Ken, here's the thing about what you're saying. You and I understand this particular language. This is what we do, right? But America generally doesn't, right? Most people go through their lives, they live paycheck to paycheck, certainly under this administration, and they're trying to get their kids to school and trying to make the car payment, trying to get groceries on the table. So, crime is not ridden in every single family. So they don't know too much about the criminal justice system. And when you tell them the word misdemeanor, it almost seems like, well, like they say, like the reformers say, oh, they're going to steal a loaf of bread because they're starving. That is simply untrue. There are so many stores, and I mean chain stores throughout New York City that have decided that they cannot withstand the
Mhm.
criminality. And you know, the industry, the insurer industry that I would like to speak to on this, Ken, is the crime insurer.
Yeah.
You know, the the big box crime insurer, right? You know, they have to be saying to themselves, we can no longer insure Neiman Marcus. We can no longer insure Macy's and CVS from criminality when the local prosecutors refuse to even, you know, bring that to an arrest. So what it does is it just continues to crumble society, and it just is moving us in this direction where morality no longer exists because there's simply no consequence to crime. It's like letting my little boy, when he was, you know, buck wild, just run out in the middle of traffic and taking a chance. It's ridiculous.
Well, I think of the original reforms that were enacted in New York went into effect right about months before the pandemic. And I
1/1/20.
and I always use that as an example. This is how bad it was. This is how bad it was immediately in New York, because during the middle of the pandemic, they did their very first round of rollbacks. They did their first part of this has gone too far. And what happened immediately to cause even a state that's so strongly democratic to say we've gone too far?
Love this question. This is my favorite question. I'll tell you what happened. Don Cuomo was on the color TV every single day. He was doing his little media blitzes with COVID and the numbers in New York, and all the women around the United States were just madly in love with him. You know, even someone I know in Jersey said, oh my goodness, I could fall in love with him. No, 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 no. So what happened was the reporters started going, Governor, Governor, COVID, COVID, bail reform, Governor, Governor, bail reform, COVID. How about that bail reform, Governor? Can we get a comment on that, Governor? So the governor said, I can't have that during my little press conferences because my ego cannot withstand it. Go back in the room and add a few charges to this nightmare. Give them back vehicular homicide. So that's what he did. And then in the omnibus bill that year, that same year, which was April of 20, we got the First Amendment because he just couldn't stand it. And that's why he did it, not because he particularly cared about humans.
So the first round of rollbacks was really just to pull back on the list of offenses and give back a couple of offenses that required bail. I mean, it wasn't intended. It looks like to me it wasn't intended to actually have an effect. It was mostly window dressing.
It was total window dressing, like, you know, selling narcotics on school property. Maybe we should put that back. Oh, okay, Andrew. Okay, let's do that. Okay, so that's what they did. So that was rollback number one. And now we're on rollback number four. So we're like, boom, boom. We're like, you know, Rocky style over here in New York. It's amazing.
Well, I know, and it seems like all of the reforms and the rollbacks have been done through the budget process. And so I guess that takes all the debate out. It kind of forces everybody to vote for the budget. And is that, I mean, I don't know if that's something that's uniquely New York, but is that how they pass difficult measures in New York a lot of times?
I mean, that's how they pass difficult measures in politics, period. Omnibus bills. You know, they're given a bill, they're given an omnibus bill, what, 24, 48 hours, you know, beforehand, and it's about this thick. And it's like 3,000 or so pages. They're not going to read it. Their staffers don't have time to read it. And then they have to vote on it. And essentially, they're told by their senior leadership that if they don't vote the way they're supposed to vote, that their political careers are over. So, of course, they all vote in line. And, you know, ironically, when we went to go see one of the senators out in Long Island in kind of a very nice area, I said to him, do you have any idea, you know, what he was like, well, I didn't know that was in there, that particular thing. I didn't realize that was in there. I was like, well, but you already, you know, voted for it. The people here have like $2.8 million homes. And, you know, he was aghast.
So we have a period of time, a couple of years where we start rolling back. It sounds like the first several rollbacks were just to widen the offenses or bring back offenses that were bail eligible.
Mhm.
What effect did those have on the criminal justice system and on crime?
Oh, it's still happening. It's just horrendous. I mean, it's created such a large victim pool, and it shows that, no matter what, that there is no criminal ideology as it pertains to recidivist offenders. People are getting attacked all over New York City. People that we call EDP, emotionally disturbed people, that were once either hospitalized or incarcerated, given their antipsychotics at 1 and 9, and given their 3 square, and being taken care of medically. Were not a huge threat to New York society. But once they got all released, a lot of them have schizophrenia. They're no longer on their medications, and they cannot, and I'm not trying to defend them in any way, but a lot of them cannot tell the fundamental differences between right and wrong. And that's why they'll throw you on a subway track.
One of the things that's happened since bail reform was passed was Eric Adams was elected the mayor of New York City. What
Uh-huh.
kind of, and he's a former police officer. I know he's been in the news
Captain.
recently, but what impact did that have on the criminal justice debate?
Oh, it's a loaded question. Um, it had some impact. I mean, he went and had a different conversation than Governor Hochul, and they would butt heads from time to time. But at the end of the day, the mayor of New York City, although many of you see him on TV, he is not the governor. So he doesn't create state law. Although New York City does have its own government, this particular issue is a statewide issue. So his stance on many of these issues didn't necessarily change the issue, if that makes any sense.
Well, we in the last, I guess last November, we had a governor's election in New York, and I thought it was going to be probably closer than it was, but I think that election had a big impact on Governor on her uh, view of criminal justice reform. Do you agree?
Um, I mean, you want my honest opinion?
Yes.
You sure?
Uh, I wouldn't ask if I didn't.
Okay. Well, her name is Kathy Hochul, and she was told by Nancy Pelosi that the reason that they lost the House in Washington, D.C. was because Kathy Hochul couldn't get it together with all the crime being in the media, and that's why the DNC lost. So if she were to have a political career, she needed to get it together in the state of New York. So from a political perspective, I would imagine that's why, that, and because Zeldin came in within 6 points of her, and this was the key issue in the race, she wanted to have this zipped up. So she had it zipped up more so than anyone's done thus far. Does there need to be some more kind of fine tuning? We'll see what this year brings. But listen, she went up against, the leader and the speaker, and she took the budget a bit longer, and she wasn't going to budge on this because it was a really bad stain on her politically and nationally.
Well, it seems like this cycle, she was the leading voice, or she almost was an ally of our position that we needed change. We needed further changes to the bail reform um, statute that was passed several years before. And I agree, she wasn't going to budge. She was demanding that we repeal a certain section, and that's ultimately what happened.
Well, I think with Governor Hochul, because she was the lieutenant governor when Don Cuomo, signed bail reform on April 2019 into the budget, I think because she was the lieutenant governor at the time, she was getting a lot of flack about it. And she needed to, to cure it. So, so that's what she did. And she didn't want the blame to be on policymakers anymore because that was the media, part. So, the shift was that really it was the judges. So the judges got thrown under the bus. And the reason why all of this hullabaloo was so completely out of control was because of the judicial branch. Meanwhile, the legislation originally, when it was designed, completely usurped the
Mhm.
judicial branch. So that was a lot of malarkey, if you will. But it doesn't change the fact that now, by removing those three detrimental words to the bench, the least restrictive condition or the least restrictive means, now you have given back the power that the judicial branch was initially supposed to have anyway by virtue of the framers.
We've seen this least restrictive conditions, least restrictive means language. We've seen that in the New Jersey plan, and it seems like that's just a backdoor way to tie judges' hands to try to get rid of the bail industry. And so, I agree with what you've said. The original bill that passed in New York was taking away discretion from judges, and by
Mhm.
repealing this, it was intended to put it back. And I find it interesting that in the process they were saying, well, the judges weren't doing their jobs and setting bail. They were, and so it was their fault. It really wasn't the politicians' fault. When, if you think about it, the original statute passed, that was what it was intended to do, was tie the judges' hands so they could not do their jobs. And so it's kind of an interesting full circle on the reform movement in New York.
I mean, from a PR perspective, it was a good move. To move the blame away, right? And fix the problem, shift away the blame, get on to the next topic. And basically that's what she did. I mean, and
Yeah, because
bravo to her.
she said she didn't plan to make any further changes to the bail reform statute. But I mean, that seemed like lip service to the people that opposed it. I mean, as you've mentioned, you have leaders of the legislature who were adamantly opposed to any changes. And, they're still saying, hey, this is all politics. The
Yeah.
statute was working and there was no reason to repeal it. I mean, how do we ever, I mean, what would change those people's minds to ever say that the statute's not working?
Well, there's only one way. And it's a very, very, very New York City way. It's a very Brooklyn way. It's if you're from where I'm from, this is the only way. It makes sense. You take the politician, and all my correction people would agree with this, all the leadership. You take a politician and you put them in a DOC uniform for the week, and you let them be a correction officer for a week and let them see what it's like. And the other, maybe the way is instead of living behind the gated community, give them an apartment in the projects where everybody else lives, right? Low income housing. Let them live there where all the shootings are going on and the babies are being killed and the little kids can't play in the park in the front of the projects anymore. And there's needles and stuff everywhere. If these policymakers were willing to put on a uniform or willing to live like much of their constituents, then and only then would they maybe shift their position.
What is it about the original statute do you think that caused recidivism in crime to take off?
Well, Ken, I can tell you this, and this is a true story, and you know me a long time, and I'm a truth teller. When bail reform was getting done, and it was getting signed by Don Cuomo, one of my longtime clients, who is a narcotic entrepreneur, came into my office and said to me, "Is this true?" I said, "Is what true? My guys aren't going to get arrested?" I said, "Oh, well, I can't give you legal advice." He goes, "But you've been writing bail for us for a long time. Tell me, am I gonna have to call Empire? And I said, nope. And he was like, you are kidding me. When does this start? I said, it starts on 1/1. And he was, said some other things, and we bid each other farewell, if you will. But they knew.
Well, and that's been my criticism of a lot of the bail reform movement, because organized crime, gangs, career criminals have looked at it, found the holes, and they've
Mhm.
made a killing out of it. And that's just one
Right.
more example of organized crime just making a killing out of bail reform.
Right, right. And some people would look at my little story that I just said and said, "Oh, well, she made money off of him." Yes, that is true. We do actually earn a living. However, we also ensure the defendant's appearance in court, which brings a victim whole, which means that the prosecutor and the judge do not have to sentence in absentia, and the court does not have to continue to pay all of its staffers without the human body of an offender, of the accused. All of that actually matters in accountability in every single criminal justice system throughout the United States of America.
Well, and I'd like to tell people the difference pre New York reform and post New York reform is
Mhm.
there was a heavier use of the private surety bail system for all these offenses. And the private surety bail system has the lowest failure to appear rate. That means more people show up for court. More people show up for court, their cases
Right.
get resolved. Just everything you just said.
Well, there's
And
a reason.
yes, and if everything else, these changes cause people, hey, to find out there's no consequences if I don't show up for court. And they also carry with them a much higher failure to appear rate just as a result of just that's the norm across the country. But then during COVID, they just really took off as there's no consequences. And then the chaos that was created, I mean, the criminal element saw that as a green light to commit more crime. And they're still seeing these reforms as a green light to commit more crime. That's why you're starting to see maybe it slow down, but it's not coming down because there's still parts to the original statute. One of the things that I've heard is that the reforms have still not changed or allowed a judge to consider dangerousness. Is that true?
Yeah, New York is one of the few states that hasn't moved to a dangerousness statute. Assemblyman Joe Lentol, who's now retired, who is at the New York State Assembly for 100 years. He's a great guy, great old man, love him. I was a Democrat, and he's still with us. And he said, it'll be a cold day in hell before New York State becomes a preventative detention state. And he didn't want, and a lot of them that were in the 60s and things like that, that really knew, like when the bail reform movement kind of really started, he had a really good gauge of understanding of this issue. And, judges in New York State do have to consider many, many things. And do they honestly can kind of off the record consider dangerousness, but not really have to say it in that particular way on the record? Yes, of course. And certainly now that this last amendment was just done. But it's not a state that does consider dangerousness. And I believe in that. I believe in that because I believe that sometimes judges can be biased, and bail's not designed to be punitive.
Well, I don't want New York to become a release or detain state. I think, there's no state in the United States that can mirror the federal system for release or detain, especially when you look at the stats and say they detain almost 75% of the people that are arrested. I mean, New York's just like Texas. You can't afford to house 75% of the people that are arrested awaiting trial. And that's cost prohibitive. If New York's not even going to implement the New Jersey plan. They're not going to implement a arrest or release or detain model because they can't afford it. let's talk about what is left of the original reforms. Is it a small group of crimes where the judges cannot set bail?
Um, I mean, it's just a very small grouping. Now that narcotics, are back in recidivism, they can consider open cases and things like that, and they can actually set bail on, a recidivist, a misdemeanant recidivist.
So that
So
would be a misdemeanor person who has a criminal history.
that continues to, like, for example, like these shoplifting syndicates. They're a huge, huge, huge problem in New York City. So yeah, I mean, so that's part of the change.
I'm going to ask you a question, and I don't know the answer to this. That my it's my understanding that one of the arguments that Eric Adams was making is that we have this small group of people who are really committing a large percentage of the crime in New York City. It's almost like we have a city within the city. We have a group of a city of criminals who are wreaking havoc on the larger city of New York. Do you have you heard that argument? Do you agree with it?
Well, I mean, I agree with it maybe by 50%. New York
Sure.
has definitely turned into like Gotham City. I mean, we definitely need Batman and Robin. There's no question about it. But maybe 50% of the recidivists are still committing crime because obviously that's how they make a living. And, a lot of them are involved in criminality. But the other 50%, no, a lot of it is, domestic violence, new gang activity, addiction issues, mental health issues. There's a tremendous, tremendous amount of addiction issues as it pertains to arrest in the entire state of New York. It's not really something that is sexy enough to hit the media. It's certainly not something that I think policymakers want to talk about. And also, interestingly enough, and obviously, it's not quantified. So that is something that we put together this year. We got a bill numbered to kind of quantify things differently, a reporting bill, and we're going to move that forward next year.
I liked the idea of I agree with you that it's not all criminals. With recidivism, but you do have probably 50%, like you said. But what I think that the judges and the criminal justice reform movement does impact is the gray area between the two cities. Because at any given moment, you have a group of people living between law and order and lawlessness, and they're impacted by judges, the criminal justice system, and the bail reform movement. And they're being influenced on today, what am I going to do? Oh, I saw somebody get punished, so I'm going to be a law and order citizen. Or you see, well, there's no consequences for doing anything. I'm joining the crime city. And for the last few years, it's almost like the city within the city's been robust with growth because people see no consequences in the gray area between the two. And so I think that, you know, I'm hopeful that this last round of reforms will have a big impact on the gray area. Are you seeing are you seeing changes? Are you seeing an impact on the criminal justice system from these changes already?
I mean, I think it's too soon to really kind of evaluate that. I mean, this is just something that was signed maybe 5, 6 weeks ago. So I think it's a little too soon to kind of make that statement. I will tell you, as a kid from New York City, um, going to into Manhattan is called New York County.
Mhm.
So going into New York County is astounding. It's just really, really, really sad. And I think it's going to take New York City probably a decade to come back to where it once was.
I've argued that in a certain level, we're just repeating the mistakes of the 60s and we're doing the same cycle where we felt safe for a while and we were more forgiving on our criminal law. And now we're seeing the consequences of that. And we may have the backlash that we had in the 80s as a result. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's just it's sad. And and here's an interesting fact that's never really published. Prior to the enactment of bail reform in New York County, which is Manhattan, 70% of the arraigned were released on their own recognizance. So only 30% of the
Mhm.
arrest pool was held. And out of that 30%, likely half of them being held had to do with other holds, parole, probation, things of that nature. So really only 15% were actually held in custody on some sort of bail.
I've always heard that if there's this phrase that I've always heard: those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. It just seems like we're repeating our mistakes from the past, and we're falling victim to different talking points, but the same result. We were told that poor people were stuck in jail, and we needed to tie the hands of judges so that poor people couldn't be stuck in jail. Well, we tied the hands of judges, and the criminal elements just had a field day. So, what is it going to take to right the ship? You
Well, I
said it's
mean,
going to take a decade, but what's it going to take?
honestly, it's going to take a new president of the United States of America. So that election's coming up pretty soon. And if the people that watch this and see this, that grew up like me, Cuban American, dad was a Blue Dog Democrat, so was the entire family, think I have to vote for people that support criminality because of a democratic ideology, well, you're wrong. That is not true. Take away the party name, whether the name is Republican, the name is Democrat, and simply and only vote for law and order, for your safe community, for your children. Choose one issue when voting for the president. That should be the issue so that it protects yourself, your children, your grandchildren, your families, your neighbors. And that's the way that maybe we can get back pieces of society. Because if the president of the United States is a law and order man, then he can make sure that these big cities like New York, like St. Louis, like Houston, don't get the federal money to fund these programs that are essentially abortions of justice.
We've talked about how the original drafter of the bill, the leadership of the legislature in New York, are still staunch supporters of these reforms, even as we've rolled them back two, three, four times now. And so they kind of scoff at these rollbacks and say it's just politics. And you kind of see this across the country where we're starting to see a lot of rollbacks. We're getting a lot of data now, and the data is all very consistent that these reforms are not working and they're just making money for the criminal elements. You still see pockets of people pushing for bail reform. You still see pockets for defunding the police. And I don't know how we ever get two people on the same page when we're dealing with people that will never acknowledge something is not working, because it looks like to me they have a different agenda. They want chaos, they want decriminalization. And so this is just one step further to get to their goal.
Well, I mean, let's also, call a spade, Ken. They also want to make sure that their balance sheets are in the green. So, I mean, the reason why policymakers fund um, insane issues is because of big money, like Soros money, like the Koch brothers. There's tons and tons of the Arnold Foundation. There's just tons and tons and tons of money behind these movements, and they're not willing to give away the money because, saying that they were wrong on the issue means that they're no longer going to get that money. And they really just want the money. And it's unfortunate, but there are very few policymakers nationally. They're kind of in the minority that care about their constituents and not about political donation.
Well, I think that's a really good point, and I would have thought at one point that that almost is on the crazy side of politics. But when I've looked at this issue, and there's a lot of think tanks. There's think tanks on the left. There's think tanks on the right. But on the issue of criminal justice reform, they all come to the same conclusion, or they did 5 or 6 years ago. And if you looked, a lot of the funding, there was from all the same sources. And so on
Right.
the criminal justice issues, they were all coming to the same conclusion because they were all getting contributions from the same source. And, and I understand the different pushes, from the right, you want to spend less money just in general. So in Texas, they want to spend less jails on jails. They want to close prisons. And so that worked for a while, but then it quit working. And now you just see those groups go really quiet. And they come up with, as you said, the Arnold Foundation comes up with a risk assessment, which is supposed to be the crystal ball, the little crazy 8 ball that's going to tell you everything you need to know, which is just crazy because the bail industry, or the secret sauce for getting people to court, has a whole lot more to do with it than just simple release or detain. And for them to say that it's just, they can decide it with an algorithm tells you that they really don't know criminal justice reform, because you got to get people to court. And if you can't get people to court, no matter how many times you release them, and they just have a stupid failure to appear, it still does the same it does the same harm to the criminal justice system, and the case is still put on hold. And so I kind of agree with you on that. I think, another reason why I agree with you is in Texas. Texas has always been a conservative state. Even when it was a Democrat state, it was conservative. But now, you know, the Republicans win 13 points now, because to get enough money to run a statewide race as a Democrat, you have to take policies that will get people to contribute to you. And those policies then make it impossible for you to win in Texas. And so that's the same argument. That's really the same analysis. If you want the money, you've got to take this position. If you take this position, well, then you're going to lose by 13 in Texas. And that's really kind of where we are on the criminal justice reform movement. You still have people pushing for the same ideas. In Texas, we had a bill passed, not passed, a bill that died in the House because there was a proposed amendment to have a presumption of a personal bond for all misdemeanors in Texas, which would essentially be the New York model, simple release. We're just calling it a personal bond for all misdemeanors. And that wasn't going to pass in Texas, but it just shows you they're still pushing for this model that has proven now in California and in Houston and New York to create chaos. And these people that we want to call our friends will never acknowledge that they're not working. So we just have to go beat them.
I don't call them my friends, so I would tell them that right to their face. That's the difference probably with me. But, I will tell you this. One of the conversations about this issue and many other issues, whether you're talking about what children read until they're in their third grade and things like that, is because these people that you're referring to have removed the importance of the familial connection, right? Matter of fact, they've labeled parents as terrorists, even. So, what the reason why secured bail has worked for hundreds of years is because, as you well know, when we put a bond up for someone, we involve the circle of love: grandma, mom, auntie, uncle, brother, sister, cousin, mom, dad. So we're looking for those familial connections. In the state of New York, it's part of the law. When the district attorney is looking at a bond and there's a bail sufficiency hearing, bail source hearing, nebia hearing, when those hearings are in effect, the district attorney has the right to look into the connection of the guarantors versus the accused. And that's the reason why secured bail has always worked, because little Johnny is much more fearful of mama than he is, or abuela, than he is of the prosecutor. The prosecutor doesn't prosecute. He might as well be a criminal defense attorney, for the love of God. Look at this guy in New York that we have, Bragg. He might as well just be a criminal defense attorney and just remove the name district attorney. So that's the reason why we had a much more civil society back in the day, because big government wasn't able to remove the family unit from these major decisions. And now that's what they've successfully done. And that's why we have the breakdown of society as we know it.
I took I had a guest on a podcast last month who was from Washington, D.C., and we talked about the D.C. model. And he was a very nice gentleman, but he has great credentials. But one of the things that he commented was he said two things that I thought were very important. Number one, he said the DC model was very expensive, and that if they had it to do over again today, he didn't think it would pass because it wasn't that expensive when it originally passed. And he also said release without some type of supervision was a recipe for disaster. And it looks like, now that since we've passed the New Jersey reforms and we've modeled and we learned how expensive it was, it seems like we're now pushing reforms where that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to find a way to not cost a bunch of money. And so we're doing reforms that are released without supervision. And so there's someone from I would consider a very liberal area saying that that's a recipe for disaster and would be a reason to continue the private surety bail system.
Well, I don't know that they'd necessarily listen to him if he didn't have a lot of money.
Well, let's talk about what's the future hold in New York. I mean, are we now just trying to fix the damage or recover from all the injury done to the criminal justice system over the last few years?
I guess so. I mean, I hope so. I hope that the cops that go out and put their lives on the line every day to effectuate arrest based upon probable cause see that an accused is arraigned properly, detained properly, that there's a chain of custody, that there's consequence, that there's accountability in secured release. And I hope to God that the crime victim pool lessens.
What would you tell other states that were looking at bail reform today? I mean, it's got to be a small group today, but if they're looking at criminal justice reform, because you still have these groups, these think tanks going and saying the New York model is the model to pass, the Harris County model is the model of the future, even though both of those have been proven with reports from the district attorney, who's a Democrat, from reports from law enforcement, from all kinds of reports. The California model, those are failures. What would you tell those jurisdictions if they were looking at something like that today?
Well, I would tell them the exact same thing that I just told you a little while ago. So, for example, in the state of California, I would say to Bob Hertzberg, live on the streets of LA, live on the streets of San Fran, and see if after a week or 10 days without a security detail that is armed, that you feel the same exact way about criminal justice reform. It's easy for them to prophesize from the altar, right? Because basically they're looking down. They're not in the mix of this. That's the difference between electeds and the bail bondsmen. We, as the bail bondsmen, most of the time when we started, we lived on the top of our bail bond offices. Many of us did. I mean, we're the guy, the 24/7, 365 person, so I would say, get down into the actual issue and stop, being this hoity-toity person from the altar. But guess what, Ken? It's never going to happen. They're never going to do it. So I don't know what the future holds. I mean, certainly I'm not God, But I hope that many of these big cities, Atlanta, Georgia, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Austin, Texas, Houston, Texas, that has teams. I mean, they play professional athletics in these particular cities. I hope that all of the entities look at this issue and say, it's affecting us. It's affecting our public safety. There's something that the NFL can do. Stop prophesizing on social justice. You know nothing of what you speak of. You play basketball well, or you play football well, and you make $10 billion. You don't know anything about living in the hood anymore. So I think that all of these people on every single level need to come back to where the bail bondsman is. Come to the bail bond office for a week. Sit with me at Empire Bail Bonds, and you'll see a whole different side of the reality of criminal justice.
I don't know
and why it needs to stay, accountable.
I don't know if I've made this argument before, but I would argue that the lesson from the last 3 or 4 years across the country is that the private bail industry is so intertwined with the criminal justice system because it's the best mechanism. It does the best job. It's been doing it for 200 years, that any damage to the bail industry is going to do substantial damage to the criminal justice system. And that's what we've seen. And if
I rest my case, Your Honor. Look at the state of New Jersey. Look at the Garden State. Look what Krispy Kreme, the Rhino, did to the state, to the Garden State right across my river. He annihilated the industry. It no longer exists.
Well, he did harm to the criminal justice system as well.
Oh, yeah. And harm to all the humans that domicile in the state of New Jersey and visit there.
Well, and if you believe in law and order, if you believe that there should be consequences, and I believe, as a family member, that I want there to be consequences because I want my children to be productive citizens, and I don't want them to pursue, a crime lifestyle, because that's going to shorten their life expectancy and do great harm to our family. But what I want is, we have the best chance of turning people around as they get arrested and taken through the system, and before they become career criminals. Like you said, we have, involvement of the family. The family is going to turn these people around to be productive citizens. And why would we take that away from someone who's being arrested? That's really what the bail reform movement is to take away the involvement of the family. And you're really creating, that's what has happened. We've created more career criminals that we now have to deal with. And
Right.
as you said, we're going to be dealing with them for a decade, where
Right.
we wouldn't have them if we had just relied upon the criminal justice system and we thought they were doing such a injustice when they were doing such a justice instead.
And we told them so. So
yes. Well, Michelle, I know it's almost the July the 4th, and I thank you so much for talking to us about New York and all these rollbacks. I mean, I used to hear rollbacks, but it was all about Walmart and the rollbacks of prices. We've had a lot of rollbacks on criminal justice reform, bail reform, much needed, and congratulations on all the great work.
Well, thank you, but I just don't want to say that, NISBA did it, with the American Bail Coalition, with many of the state entities. I know Texas weighed in, and many of the others did as well. And, we appreciated all of the dialogue. So, it wasn't done and just by me or our former president or our board. And we're always interested in having conversations. So anyone that wants to talk to the New York State Bail Association about bail, we're always willing to do that. And thank you, Ken, for all you do for our industry. I think what you're doing is absolutely priceless and wonderful.
Well, thank you so much. And if people wanted to learn more about Michelle Esquenazi or NABA, how would they do that?
Just go to National Association of Bail Agents.com.
All right. Well, thank you, Michelle. Thank you for talking with us, and it's good to see you again.
Thank you for listening, and come back for the next episode of The Bail Post.